Adding the word to your hoop is optional, but if you decide you want to do it, here are the steps you're going to take. You'll need to print out this page that says it's the word box and the word list. And what we're going to need, so ignore this part for just a minute, you will need a piece of just white cotton. It can be the same thing if you used your own fabric. It can be the same thing that you transfer the pattern onto, just 100% cotton. And see this box right here? We are going to take this white fabric, lay it on top, and I do recommend that you take 2 little pieces of masking tape and tape this in place like that so it doesn't shift on you while you are doing this part. And then you will need to trace it onto your white fabric. You cannot use the friction, however you say it. You cannot use this pen to do this part because we're about to apply heat in the next step, and it will completely erase the box you will have traced, and we need to be able to see that box. So do not use this pen. You can use these are the same choices that you had for tracing the design onto the fabric if you did that. But these are permanent markers and they're not going to be affected by heat. So use either one of those and very lightly trace this box onto your white fabric. And I say lightly because we're not really going to let this box show. We're going to trim this outline away. We're going to trim right inside this outline. So don't be very careful, go right on the outline and don't make a huge dark line. It's really just a guide for cutting out later. But anyway, trace that box onto your white fabric. When you do that, you'll take that off and then you will choose your word, whichever word you choose it on the list and lay it on top of your word, and you're going to trace over the word. That is what I have done right here already. This is the word I've chosen. So I took my pen and I taped this down again so it wouldn't shift. This is the really important part. And I very carefully traced over the word with my pen. You can leave it with just the pen, and that's personally what I prefer to do. You could also very carefully take 1 strand of black thread or even like black sewing thread, which was a little not quite as soft and a little bit smaller even than 1 strand of DMC black thread, and you could very carefully stitch this. Honestly, I prefer to just leave it like this because it's a thinner line and it's a little bit more detailed. So, but do whichever one you want to do. Now we will take this off of here. All right, we'll remove the tape. That's important. And we will move on to the next step. The next step is we are going to use this product right here, which is called Wonder Under. It's a fusible interfacing that you can use to fuse one piece of fabric onto another. And it's very thin and you can sew through it if you want to be doing that. We're not going to be sewing through it, but it's just a nice thin way to adhere this box that we're going to cut out, not right now, but in a minute, onto the felt that's going to be the banner. So this is, I can't remember the Pellon number, it's like 804, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, it has one side, you probably can't see it here, I don't know, but it has one side that has a kind of a rough, that's the kind of a web on it, that's the adhesive side. It has one side that's the paper side, so that's smooth. We are going to use a hot iron and iron this Wonder Under onto the, not the front, onto the back of your word. Do not iron it like this, because if you put this on your ironing board or whatever surface you're ironing on, and if you iron this down, you're going to stick this part that's overlaying onto whatever this surface is, your ironing board, your fabric, whatever surface you're ironing on, okay? Don't do it like this. So I need to trim this Wonder Under so that whatever size your fabric is, this Wonder Under is inside the edges of my fabric. You just want to make sure that it completely covers this box that you traced earlier, but it's got to be inside the edge of your fabric. So let me go trim that down. All right, I went and looked, and it is actually Pellon number 805. But if you just ask for Wonder Under, or if you do a search for Wonder Under, it will come up. Anyway, I have now trimmed this so that it fits inside the edges of my fabric, and I'm going to take the rough side. All right, this is the rough adhesive side. I'm going to iron it to the back. I'm going to iron it to the back side of the fabric, making sure that I am covering the word box completely. It says use a hot dry iron in about 5 to 8 seconds to get this part, do this onto the back of the fabric, because this is just thin paper. You don't want to over iron it because you can almost sort of melt away all of that adhesive. You don't want to just melt it into oblivion. So, you know, start with 5 to 8 seconds, let it cool, and then just very carefully check to make sure it's well adhered and you're ready to move on. This now has the Wonder Under ironed onto the back, and I am going to put this aside for just a moment. We're not quite finished with it, but I am going to put it aside for just a moment, because now we're going to move on to the next step, which is to make the banner itself. And we're making this out of wool felt. You can use acrylic felt, but honestly, once you use wool felt for anything, you will never want to go back to acrylic, because wool felt is just so nice. And this comes in this beautiful, deep magenta color. And so you will need to print off the banner pattern. And if you have it, I would suggest, if you have some sort of heavier weight paper like cardstock, to print it onto a heavier weight paper. You can print it onto regular copy paper. The other thing you can do, which is probably going to be even easier, is to print it onto regular copy paper, cut it out, and then you can put it onto a heavier weight paper. Like if you have a file folder, that is a great weight of paper. If you have just some random piece like a greeting card that you are about to throw away, put it on there, use a very sharp pencil and put it down, and then trace it onto that slightly heavier weight paper, and that will make the next step much easier. You can do it if you just cut it out of copy paper and don't put it on heavier weight paper, but I promise this will make the next step easier, because we are going to take our felt and put this down, and we're going to trace around it. Tracing onto felt is a little bit hard because while it's smooth, it still has fibers. You know, doesn't have fiber. Well, it does have fibers, but it's a little bit hard to trace because the pen can catch on the fibers, but it can be done. For this part, if you want, you can use the friction pen, because it's not going to matter. The line, actually we want the line to go away, but it's not really going to matter. You can use this, or you can use the same pen that you use to trace the word. Put it onto your felt, hold it down carefully, and trace around it. Sometimes on felt with a pen like this is a pencil, but don't use a pencil, use a pen. But I would almost make little dots. But honestly, with this nice quality felt, you can, and this pen worked great, you can just sort of go over it, make dots, whatever, carefully lift it up and make sure it's being traced. I've already done that on the other side, so you can see there. And then you're going to want to cut this out with scissors that have a nice sharp detail edge. These are the Fiskars microtip scissors. I use them for all of my felt work. Love them. Have them in the shop. And now you're going to cut this out. And since this is a symmetrical design, you know, follow the line, but if you're inside or out of it, inside or outside of the line, it doesn't really matter, because we're going to be able to flip this over and use this side that does not have the black, does not have the traced line on it. So, you know, be accurate, but cut this out with your fine tip scissors. That is cut out. Before we move on, do not throw away these scraps, because we are going to use those elsewhere on this hoop. So save those. Now that we have this cut out, remember, don't use the side that has the mark on it, the marks where you traced it. Flip it over. Now we are going to come back to this, and I'm going to cut out this box. I still have the Wonder Under on the back, so leave it just like that. It'll make it easier to cut. And now I am going to very carefully trim this box right inside this line because I don't really want this black line to show. So I'm going to very carefully, I mean right inside that line. You just trimming off the black line. Just like that. So go all the way around this box, trim it out. Here is that box. Now you will want to peel away the Wonder Under on the back of this. It should be pretty easy. It's not a really strong adhesive. Anyway, I won't make you watch me do that. Anyway, peel the paper off, and now we're going to iron this because now the fabric box has a very light adhesive on the back of it. Take the correct side of your felt, place it right in the center, and then iron it again. And the instructions say iron it this time like 10 to 15 seconds. But I think the instructions are talking about ironing it from the back. We're not really going to iron it from the back because if we iron it from the back, A, we won't know if this is in position, and B, we won't know if it's it's having to iron through the felt. So I iron it from the top, so you may not have to do it 10 to 15 seconds. Like I said, be aware that you're not trying to completely melt the adhesive. You want it to melt. You're not trying to melt it away. You want to melt it so that it sticks. So center this, again, hot dry iron, and iron the box onto the felt banner. We have one more step to finish this banner, and right now, while it looks a little bit like a banner, this pattern has been designed for us to fold it and make it and give it some dimension, so it looks like a sort of like a waving banner. So to do that, take this, and there's a little bit of a, if you can see that right there, there's a little bit of a corner. It's a little hard to see, but fold this back right at that line, and it is made so that if you'll pay attention right here for the edge of the box to be parallel to your fold. So here and here should be parallel. In other words, you're not trying to fold it like that. See how this line and this line are not parallel? And you're not trying to fold it like that because that's not parallel to this. So fold it right on that little corner. So now these are parallel here and here. And now you can hold that in place and now fold that little tab back at that angle. I know it's hard to see because my fingers are in the way, but do you see how that now looks a little bit more like a banner? So to hold this in place, we are going to put a couple of little tacking stitches, and I'm using one strand of the 718, whatever that kind of plum color is, and I'm going to try to hide these stitches as much as I can. So I'm going to try to flip this over here so it'll be kind of behind there and put a little stitch. I haven't done this yet, so I'm just trying to keep it kind of, I still want to retain some of the dimension of it, hoping these little stitches are hidden. So let me flip it back. I'm going to need more stitches, obviously, because that felt has enough stiffness to it that it really wants to. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to come right on the edge, kind of the underside edge, if I can hide it as much as possible. Can you see what I'm doing? The needles, oops, sorry, the needle's coming up like from underneath and just catching the edge of that little fold. Very hard to see. I know, I'm sorry. And I'll go back to the back. And I unthreaded my needle, of course. So let me go fix that. Should have gotten a longer thread. All right, so I'm hoping you can see this well enough. I came up from the back and I just caught the little roll kind of on the back side of the roll and just got a little bit of that thread and took the thread to the back. And then now, and I put like a stitch here, where am I looking? Here, here and here. But now I need to flip it over and do the same thing on the back. So where that fold is right there that goes around, I'm very carefully trying to just catch a little bit of the felt. I'm trying not to bring the needle through to the front of the felt so it won't show. And catch that fold right there. And do a little tacking stitch. Not pretty on the back, but once it's done, you can release it, and now that little fold, that little waving fold, will stay in place. And once you have stitched both sides of that banner, that's what it looks like. So now it has kind of a lot of dimension to it. There's those little stitches on the back. And when you're ready to add it to your hoop, you can just use the same thread and just catch this back side, put it in place on your hoop, and just put a few little tacking stitches on your hoop to attach it there. And that way, if you want to, you can also change the word out from year to year if you wanted to do that. Anyway, that is our finished banner. Now we get to work on the Stumpwork Butterfly. And honestly, this is one of the parts of this design that I have been the most excited about. Now, stump work, you may be familiar with that term, but if you're not, it's actually been around since, the technique has been around and the term has been around since the 1600s. But it didn't really begin being used more frequently until the late 1800s. But it has really enjoyed a resurgence recently. So let's talk about our very modern Stumpwork butterfly. Stumpwork just means three-dimensional. It's either raised like a padded embroidery or something that has an armature, or like a wire frame on it, which is what we're doing, so that it can be lifted off the fabric and shaped if needed. So here's the method we are going to use to stitch this Stumpwork butterfly. The first thing we're going to do is to stitch down the wire outline, or the wire armature. And we're going to use 24 gauge wire for that. You could also use 26. 26 gauge is a little bit thinner, finer than this, but so I think either one would work fine, be just fine. And so cut off a length of wire that is long enough to go around the shape you want and with a little bit of extra. Now, when it comes to cutting wire, I recommend using wire cutters. You can find, fairly inexpensive wire cutters, or like a jewelry set at, the craft stores. You can also use like a pair of utility scissors. Obviously, you all know not to use your nice embroidery scissors or your nice fabric scissors, but just a strong, sturdy pair of even inexpensive scissors. This wire is so thin, it cuts really easily. So just don't use your good fabric scissors, okay? And we are going to start off with, now what we're going to do is when I stitch this down, I'm just going to use one strand of thread, and I'm going to use, probably for the outline, you don't have to switch colors. You could even just use a white thread. But I am going to be a little extra, and I'm going to use the color of thread just for these little quick stitches to hold this onto the fabric in the same color of the section that it's going to be next to. So I know this is going to be blue down here, so I'll use blue thread. In this section between here and here is going to be green, so I'll use one strand of green, pink around this outside edge, and then so on. So that's why I'm using different colors of thread. So start off, and I'm not going to bend it in shape first. I'm going to stitch it and bend it as I go. Let me move this around a little bit so you can see it better. All right, I think that's a little bit easier to see. And before I even get to actually sewing the wire down, I am going to do something different on the butterfly than I do when I usually stitch. Normally when I stitch, I tie a knot in the end of my thread and just pull it through and let the knot be on the back of the fabric. Well, we're going to be cutting this out of the fabric later and trimming very close. And so I am trying to eliminate any kind of knots or anything on the back that might get in the way of that. So instead of using my usual knot, I am going to use just a couple of little tiny bitty stitches to hold the thread down, and that way I don't have to have any kind of bulky knot on the back. Usually I don't care about knots, but on these are really tiny little pieces. So here's what I'm going to do. So I know I'm going to be stitching along in here with this blue. So I'm just going to come up from the back, And so here's what I have figured out is the easiest. I'm going to go to the end of the thread, and I'm just going to hold it with about 1/2 of an inch between my fingertips. That way, now when I pull it through like this, I know you can't see on the back, but now I know when I pull it so that my fingers stop it on the back, I know now that I have about 1/2 of an inch of thread on the back. I mean, you could flip your hoop over, but I don't want to take it out of this stand. So now I've got about 1/2 of an inch of a tail on the back. I'm just going to make a teeny tiny stitch, and I'm going to make one more tiny stitch just anywhere, just inside the area that I know is going to be blue. And now I'm going to make sure that I go down. So I'm going to split that little itty bitty stitch like that. And now I know my thread is secure, so that when I come up, I can come up and that thread's not going to come out. That tail on the back, at some point I will go back there and trim it off, but for now I can just leave it. So now I'm ready to go. Take my wire. I'm going to make sure that I leave, I can trim this off later, so just lay it on there, leave some extra. So now I can come up, and I'm going to come up right on the line and go down right on the line. I keep catching my thread. All right, so there's my first stitch holding the wire in place. And I'm just going to move over about 1/4 of an inch and do the same thing, making sure that I'm right on the line. Now, I'm going to say something here that's going to apply for this whole wing. Every time I come up, I'll make another stitch for you. I'm going to come up right next to the wire here on the inside, but it's when I go down on the outside that I really want to be careful. I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit, but when I go down on the outside, I don't want to go over that wire and go down into the fabric way outside this line. In fact, I even want to angle my thread so it's going under the wire. I mean, that's exaggerated, but just a little bit. Because as I mentioned, later on, we're going to be trimming this fabric very closely to these outside stitches. And if I have any stitches that are, on that side of the line over here, on this side of the line at all, they could easily get snipped off. I mean, we're going to be trimming closely. So just for this stitching and the other stitching we're going to do along this outside edge, always make sure that you're really, really close to the wire or angling your needle underneath back towards the center of the wing. And now I'm into the section that I know is going to be green, so I will do the same thing with my green thread. I have one strand. I'm holding the end. I'm going to leave that little tail. Make one tiny stitch. Come up nearby and go down into that stitch to hold it in place. Hold that thread. And now I'm ready to continue on attaching the wire to the edge of the shape. Like that. I've switched to pink now, and so far this has been pretty easy. We've had just this very softly curved, sort of straight line. Now we get to the part where we need to shape the wire. And it's going to be very helpful if you have a tool to help you with this. You can use either some needle nose pliers like this. Again, this came in the same set that I got the wire cutters from. I also use, these are like big, huge tweezers that are very helpful because they have a nice, this is not a sharp tip. It's not going to pierce the fabric, but it has a small tip. You could probably also even use like tweezers that you would use for like your eyebrows. So that would work too if you have those. But so I've stitched along. I'm ready to make this turn right here. So it kind of helps if you'll hold with your tweezers or whatever, and then just gently bend that wire so till you get to the next point where it's gonna turn. So I'm gonna not do that yet. I'm gonna go ahead and sew this down. So I've got my pink thread right here. sure I'm on the line. And sewing it, attaching it as you go, makes it much easier because your stitches are holding it in place also while you're trying to bend it into shape. All right, so those 2 stitches are going to hold it there, and now I need to make the little, I need to make this next scallop. So I'm going to hold it, hopefully you can see this. I'm going to hold it like, sorry. All right, hold it right there, hold it right on that point where it's going to turn. Sorry if my hand's in the way. And then slowly bend it back. And it does kind of want to fight you a little bit. And remember, if you don't get it perfectly on this line, that's totally fine because it's a butterfly. And, you know, butterflies are not, they're part of nature. They're not perfect. So I've got that little bend going the other direction, and now I can sort of, I'm going to bend it a little bit more than I need, and now I'm going to use my finger to bend it back to make that second scallop. All right. You can use your fingers as well. Just kind of manipulate it a little bit until it's pretty much in place. Go ahead and see if I can't get this next one kind of, no, I'm going to sew it first. So I'll sew this little curve down. I'll put a stitch right there where it curves. Because as I said, having it stitched down really helps you shape it more accurately because it's not, you know, shifting on you. All right, so just keep going around the whole thing until you, and switch colors as you go until you get around to the end. I'm almost to the end. I just have to stitch the blue section down, but I was going to tell you that when it comes time to end this thread, same thing. I don't do a knot on the back, and I just do the exact same thing that I did previously. So I just finished stitching right here. I come up and make a little stitch. Make that second stitch, sorry that moved around, to again lock it in place. And also, so we're going to be stitching over all these little bitty tiny stitches later, and that will totally get covered up, plus it'll hold the thread more securely. So now that green has been anchored, and now I'll go finish the blue. When you get here to where the 2 wires meet, see what I've done over here, how I made them come together and then go like that. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to use my tweezers again to hold this in place on the bottom and just angle it out that way. And the same thing on the top. Hold my tweezers and then angle that one up this way so that they will generally sort of sit side by side. And now what I want to do is I want to anchor where the 2 wires meet, and I'm going to use my blue thread to do that. I still have it on the needle. So now I'm going to just, I want those to come together really closely, but I'm going to just put a couple of stitches right over both wires to hold them securely. I don't really want to go down this direction. I'm not trying to, you know, sew them on this side. I really want to do it up in the wing. So probably really just about 3 tight stitches to really hold, one more, really hold those together tightly. All right, now I will, in just a minute, I will go tie that off. But now I've got these 2 wires that are just like sticking up, and they're very much in the way. And I promise if I just left them like that, they would be annoying me with the whole rest of this project because I'd be catching my threads on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim them. I'm going to leave, you know, probably 1.25 inches. You know, you can leave as much as you want. So those are trimmed. I'm going to try to get them to kind of lay flat. And now, see what I've done here? I just took some, it doesn't matter what color, I just used white. You could stick masking tape to hold these down, but honestly, that's just gonna get in your way too. So I like to just get some, let me get it over here. Just get some white thread and just temporarily keep those things out of my way, flat against the fabric. I'm gonna get them to lay down flat. All right, get them to lay down flat. I'm gonna put a couple of stitches up here. But I'm also going to make sure that I come down here to these sharp points, these where I cut them off, and I'm going to cover those up completely with stitches. Again, this is just temporary. I'll cut this off later, but it is just protecting those ends, keeping them covered so they don't continually catch in my other thread as I'm stitching. The next step is to add an edging all around this wire that will cover the wire and also give us a nice decorative edge. So to do that, we're going to use, guess what, good old buttonhole stitch. And that obviously is our theme for this project because we've used it in several different ways throughout this design. And here I am going to continue with the one strand. In fact, I realized I finished off the blue thread from over here and I should have just left it because I'm going to just start right back up right here. So I'm going to do, this is a very, very tiny buttonhole stitch and I want them to be very, very close together. So I'm going to start by coming up on the outside of the wire. And I'm going to go down inside the wire, hold open our loop, and now come up right next to, and I mean really super close to where we came up originally, outside the wire, inside the loop, and pull that stitch until it's up against the wire. Do that same thing, go down inside the wire, come up outside the wire, inside the loop, and right next to the previous stitch. Doesn't look like much now, but as you get going, you'll start to see that kind of very pretty finished covering for the wire. And our goal here is to cover the wire completely. You don't really want to see any of that gold wire showing through, so that's why we're putting the stitches very close together. I didn't choose 2 strands of thread here because one strand is tiny, and so you do have to have a little bit of patience with this part. I didn't choose 2 strands because I didn't want it so thick. This is a small butterfly. If I was doing a larger butterfly or a larger shape, I could definitely use more than 1 strand. So 1 strand is very tiny here, I understand. But I just thought 2 strands was just going to be too bulky. And just as we did when we were sewing down the wire, and this is kind of the reason I switched colors when I was sewing the wire down, we're covering that stitching. So you absolutely probably could have just used white thread to sew down the wire. It would have been fine because you're going to cover it here. But I just thought if any of that showed through, I would just already have the right color underneath there. But honestly, it's just, if you're doing your buttonhole close enough together, none of those stitches covering the wire should show. But same thing, so I'm going to do this across. When I get over to the part that's going to be green between here and here, I'll switch to green, 1 strand of green thread, and do the buttonhole stitch in green, switch to pink, and do the pink buttonhole all the way around this edge, and then switch to green, and then back to blue. Also, just thought I'd mention, when you get to the end of a color, as always, to end this thread, put it behind the row of buttonhole stitches. I'm going to put it on the outside. I'm going to sort of, these are little, it's created like a little bitty flap. I mean, it's tiny, but I do pull that little row of stitches forward. And I, again, as I said, make sure that I'm putting the needle down on the outside of the wire, but very, very close to the wire, and that will secure that row of buttonhole stitches, and then you can sort of lay that back down. Once you have covered the whole outline of the wing with the buttonhole stitch, the next thing we're going to do is to fill up the entire inside of the wing with needle painting. And just like we did in the other times that we needle painted, I'm going to first put down a row of split stitch just on this outside edge. And what that does, pull that through, it's going to fill in if there's any gap between the stitching that's all going that way, all the needle painting, and this outline. It'll provide a nice filler right there. But mostly what it does is just like it functions at the other times, it gives you a nice rounded sort of padded edge, and it looks really nice when it's sort of padded right up against this this buttonhole stitch edging. So I start out with the color, the dark pink, that you're going to be needle painting with first. We're going to use 2 strands, again, just like before. Always the sort of first section of needle painting is with 2 strands, so it gets really nice and full. Make sure you start out with a long enough piece, because you can do your split stitch and then just start needle painting with the same thread, so you don't have to stop it, cut it, start a new thread, because it's all going to be the same thread. So just make sure you start out with a fairly long piece of thread for this part. So do the split stitch along the inside here from about here all the way around to about here. All right, I finished the split stitching, and now I can start my needle painting. And you know, if you want to, just like always, if you want to draw yourself some guidelines, all of these stitches are going to angle towards this point right here. So all of them like that. If you want to draw yourself some guidelines, I didn't put them on the pattern because at some point it just gets to be too many lines and it's a little bit hard to see. So if you want to draw those guidelines on there, feel free to do that. I have my 2 strands, and now I'm going to make sure that this stitch comes up between the buttonhole and the split stitch. So I'm stitching over the split stitch. And this area, so same thing as always. Staggered stitches, stagger the ends. Be a little careful to come up right in between there. And so each wing has a sort of a narrower row, a skinnier, less wide row of dark pink, and then some light pink, which is what that little bar is. But just blend them together. This is the dark pink, the dyed thread. But same situation as always for all the needle painting we've always done. Just stagger your edges, go into the next section, just like always, keeping in mind your angles all angling towards that center point. After the dark pink, I did the medium pink. I switched to 1 strand, just like always, just like we've done before. So 2 strands for the dark, 1 strand for the medium, and now I'm in the green section, 1 strand. And I know you're asking yourself, what do I do about this thing? And a very common question is, there's some element that is sitting in the middle of a bunch of stitched area, like satin stitch, and in this case, needle painting. And the question is always, do I stitch that first or second? Do I stitch over it and stitch later? The answer is sort of, it depends. It depends on sort of how large the area is, if it can be stitched around easily. For instance, over here on this wing, there are actually 3 dots. There's this one, and then there's like a small dot and a small dot. I think there's just 2 others. And the little tiny one would have been the tiny ones would have been super hard to stitch around, to leave open. This one was just big enough, I kind of went over the edge here, but this one was just big enough to be able to leave open. And this one obviously is quite large, so I can definitely just needle paint around it. So up here I'll add a little bit of green, but I'll come right up to the edge of it. So I do want a little bit of green right there. Just pretending like, let's just say I would have put a stitch there if it was going to be a full length stitch. But I'm really just going to stitch right up to it and leave it open so that I can stitch it later. Because in this instance, it's so large and its placement is pretty important. particularly since there's two wings and they kind of need to match, that it would be hard to completely cover it and then try to figure out how big the circle was or where to put it. And so this one is easy to just stitch around. But other than that, get a few more stitches in here so it's fully stitched, right? You know, it's filled in right up to it. Don't want any spaces around it. Maybe a few more. Maybe one more. Okay, and now I can just go on my way and keep needle painting across here. This area of green is large enough that I can't really just do one stitch of needle painting. You know, I talk about rows, you know, not rigid rows, but, you know, loose rows. And so I'm going to do one row of green, you know, up in the pink, and then I'm going to do another row of green into the green leading into this section, which I think is going to be the medium green, slightly darker green. After you finish the thread painting, then you're going to stitch this dot. And so the little center dot is the dark orange, and it is the Rhodes stitch. And remember how I said earlier how the Rhodes stitch works for larger dots, circles, or smaller ones? This is an excellent example that it created almost like a button. It's so small. I used 3 strands, so it really built up a nice little dome of orange, so it sits up enough so you can really see it. And then I surrounded it with a circle of French knots with I think it's the number 12 thread that's got purple and pink and blue in it, so that's neat because you see the colors. So it really pops, really stands out on that wing. All right, what we're going to do next is one of those things that you just have to take a deep breath and have courage. Let me back up a little bit. I added the last of the French knots. There's little white French knots on each one and the little dark French knots. But other than that, it is time to cut out these wings. And I've already started here. It is scary, but use your microtip scissors and just cut this out of the hoop. Sure, you could take it out, take the fabric completely out of the hoop, but it's kind of fun to just do it like this. Okay, so I'm going to take all of this out and I'm going to very carefully cut around each of these wings, really, really close. Okay, and what I'll do is I'll sort of try to, as much as I can, and they're so tiny, is I'll lift up that little edge of that buttonhole stitch that we did right there and try to get my scissors as close as I can without trimming any of the thread. That's the scary part. These microtip scissors are good for that, great for that. If you also have some even tinier embroidery scissors, some scissors that have really sharp and precise tips, that works too. So just don't use your big massive, you know, Fiskars scissors that are huge, okay? And make sure whatever scissors you're using are nice and sharp so you're not having to kind of hack at it, all right? So I am gonna go work on these. I'm in the process of cutting out this first wing, and let me give you a few tips. First of all, make sure you have some really, really bright light to do this. Don't try to do this in a dark room, okay? I have a light that's right here, literally right above here, shining right here, so I can see every little thread. The other thing is to give the thread on the outside, hold it with this finger and try to use these fingers to give it a little bit of tension while you're cutting so that it's not just hanging and in your way. So if you give this, I can also do this, not have all that weight hanging on it. All right, so now I'm gonna use these fingers to sort of pull out right here so that I have some tension between the wing and where I'm cutting. And don't take big, long cuts. Make little teeny snips so that you can sort of feel before you snip if you've got, if you're cutting something you shouldn't cut. Just go slow. particularly, and I'm, like I said, I'm giving some tension right here with these fingers. I'm going slow, and it doesn't have to be perfect immediately. I'm going to come back and very carefully snip the extra off, but I am getting as close as I can without snipping any of the threads. So just like that. So good light, go slow, little snips. All right, getting a little resistance there, so I'm not going to force it. I'm going to just wait. Back off a little bit. Okay, so just keep working until you get it as absolutely close as you can. Here is one more piece of advice, and you can see I've got a white background right here, and because our fabric is white, it helps if you will put down some sort of darker background. This is just a sheet of pink scrapbooking paper, any color, but just something darker. So now when I'm holding this up, I can see little threads much easier, and I can make sure I'm trimming the thread and not, I mean the fabric thread, the white thread of the fabric, and not my stitching threads. So it's just a little bit easier to see that white fabric edge when you have a dark background. Now we will be putting the wings into the fabric, but before we can do that, we need to stitch the body of this butterfly. And the way we're going to do that is I have cut a piece of yarn. It's probably 4 or 5 inches long, and I have folded it in half, and I'm going to take that place where it's folded and I'm going to put it up at put it on the fabric right here, not in the circle, but in the body part. This yarn is a little fuzzy now, but anyway, I've got one strand of white thread, and I'm going to couch this folded over piece of yarn to the fabric, and I'm going to try to line up. It's going to be another one of those things that's hard to see because my fingers are in the way because I have to hold it in place. I'm going to try to line up the rounded part of the yarn with the top of the body. So I've come up right on the line of the body. Very hard to see what's going on at the moment. It'll be a little easier once I get some of this yarn couched down. First one is a little, I'm not starting at the very top because I want it to sort of be in place, and that one stitch will help me do that. Okay, so that's one couching stitch, and now I'm going to push that out of the way a little bit so that I can be sure that I come up on the line for the body. I can't see it because that yarn is there, and now I'm going to go over the yarn, push it aside on this side, and go down right on the line of the body. If I don't try to be careful about going down on the line of the body, I'll be outside of the outline of the body. I'm going to make sure I'm going to pull it down just a little bit. Once I get it going here, it'll be a lot easier, but I'm going to put another stitch right up here at the top to really hold that little piece of yarn in place, that little rounded end. Make sure that thread goes over the yarn. All right, now I can gently work down the body, doing the same thing and couching that yarn in place. And I want to put a good number of couching stitches on this because I'm just kind of coming up through that petal, because I don't want it to be, you know, like, I want it to be pretty secure. I mean, not just secure, but like, I don't want the yarn bulging out on the sides later when I'm putting the actual thread on top of it. So I'm going to use the white thread to really, like, see how it has kind of a bulge right there? I'm going to put another couching stitch of white to just really cinch that in and keep it in place, keep it from getting in my way later. And kind of hard to see the bottom of the body here underneath this petal, but that's okay. I know it just ends somewhere down there. All right, now obviously this yarn is too long. So before I get to the very end, I'm going to very carefully, so I know that the body ends, if I can sort of push those aside. Okay, the body ends about right there. I hope you can see that, like that point right there. So I'm going to cut this yarn off very carefully, making sure that I don't snip the flower petals underneath. And then I'm going to keep couching it all the way to the end. Try to get a little point on it if I can. So this is just this is just going to be a padded satin stitch, but I'm using the yarn to really build it up. Went a little crooked on me, but that'll be all right. I think that'll be covered up by the thread I'm going to use in here in a minute, the actual thread. See if I can get that to come more to a point. Not yet. All right, I'm going to very carefully trim this a little bit more. I'm going to even try to trim it at an angle. Like that. Maybe on this side. Like that. And now if I can get that to be a point, I can really cinch that down. Maybe it'll look a little bit more like a butterfly body. Like that. All right. He went a little crooked, but I don't know. We'll live with it. All right, so now I'm going to tie that off and we'll come back and we'll do the actual thread. Now I have 3 strands of that dark navy color. I actually think it's the same color that this fringe is, but I'm going to just satin stitch right over this. Whoops, I need to make my knot bigger, or my knot just came out. Hang on. All right, I'm going to satin stitch over the yarn. And it is easier to sort of start not right at the end of it and then kind of work up. And on the ends, you'll need to like really gently sort of coax those threads into place. But that is all there, I mean, this is just straight up satin stitch. And like, see how those threads kind of separated? I'm going to pull them slowly and, I got to get that yarn out from underneath there. Come on. So like I said, the ends are the trickiest parts. So let me see if I can get these threads to cooperate. All right, I'm going to go mess with that. And once you finish satin stitching the body, for the head, I just made a big, huge French knot. I used 6 strands of the same color and I wrapped the needle 3 times. So that's a really big one. But that one, it's about the only way to get a nice, big, rounded little ball like that. And now we're ready to deal with the wings. And so take the wings for one side and kind of start with the bottom wing and sort of lay it on top of the body, kind of where you think you want the wings to go. They'll kind of cross like that so that you can determine where to put the hole in the fabric that is going to, where we're going to slide these wires in. So I'm just sort of eyeing it. Okay, so it's about right. I'm going to take, now I've got the number 20 chenille needle, like the one that we use for all the yarn. And I'm going to just sort of stick it in there for a minute, just sort of as a placeholder. I'm going to take those away. And now I'm going to use this needle to make a big, huge hole. And unfortunately, it has fallen right where that ruffle is. So I'm going to try to shove that out of the way a little bit just because it'll. And then I'm going to take this needle and I'm going to kind of be aggressive and make a big hole. I'm going to pull it towards the eye because the eye is a little bit bigger. I'm going to make a hole as much as I can right there because that's going to be the bottom wing. We're going to start with the bottom. All right, now the other thing you want to do is on your wings, these wires, take your wire cutters and you're going to want to make sure that the ends of these wires are trimmed off equally. If you've got one long one and one short one, it's going to be trickier, it's going to be harder to get those two ends in this hole. Sometimes it just goes right through and sometimes you have to kind of fight with it. So I found that it's easier that if you pinch them together and then make sure that they are trimmed the same, it'll be a little bit easier. So we're going to start out, we've already got this hole here. We're going to hold our breath. That I made the hole big enough. I can see it back there. I don't know if you can see it. And then I'm going to pinch the end together and I'm going to push those wings in. And of course it's not going to go straight in. Ah, there it goes. Okay. Yay. And you want to make sure that hole is crammed up right next to the body. You don't want it next to the body. You want it like right, like almost underneath, as much as you can get it under the body. All right, so now that one is in place, and now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make a hole right next to where the other hole was, like right next to it, right up next to the body. I'm going to make a nice big hole. Hopefully it's in the right place. Okay, I'm going to pull it out. And then hold these ends together. Make sure the wing is face up. Pinch them together as much as I can. I have a feeling this one's going to give me more trouble. And it does. Because what happens is if, like, see how these wires are not pinched together close? So that when I push it in, one end goes in and then it kind of ends up moving the fibers around in the hole that I just made. So you're just going to have to work at this a little bit. Make the hole again if you need to. Make it larger if you can. And try to get these ends of these wires, if you can bend them so that they're close together, that helps, but sometimes you can't. Anyway, let me go fight with this a little bit and I'll get the top wing in. And I got those in without too much trouble, so you see it just slides right in. I'm going to make sure that the top wing is on top of the lower wing. Push them in as far as they'll go, and then what I'm going to do is I've just got 2 strands of that same dark colored thread, and so the wires on the back are, they're angled like this, and so I'm going to just stitch them down right here. Like this one's going this way and the one for the bottom wing is headed up this way. So I'm just going to put a couple of stitches right here, and even though this is dark thread, that's going to be covered up by the other wings, and I'm just holding those in place so that the wings won't shift around. So I'm going to put just a couple. I think obviously you can do this where you can look on the back of your hoop. Hopefully I'm getting those wires back there. Oops. All right, so like I said, just stitch them down so that now they don't move. I have to look on the back and make sure that I caught those. Anyway, but you can turn it over and just make sure you catch those wires and stitch them down to the fabric. So after a little bit of fiddling, I got both wings inserted and stitched the wires down on the back, and it is all finished. Once you get them in place, you can manipulate the wires, bend them a little bit, just make sure the top wings are on top of the lower wings. You can curve the wings back a little bit, but anyway, other than that, you are finished not just with this butterfly, but with this whole hoop. I hope you have had a wonderful time, and I look forward to seeing you next time.